And we're live. You all can see my screen, right?
We got it.
Fantastic. Okay, here we go. Everybody ready? All right, let's dive in. So the topic of the conversation, as Ross had mentioned, is AWS ID prefixes. What AWS doesn't cover, which is a little bit of tongue-in-cheek there. There is documentation that is referenceable inside the PowerPoint, but there's a little bit underneath the documentation that we'll cover in today. So with that, let's begin. So a little bit about me, shameful plug, I know, but let's do that, right? So there's my linkage down there for LinkedIn, should you want to reach out. I also find that folks like to ask questions. There's also my Twitter handle. So please feel free to reach out to me if there's a question that you didn't want to proffer during the presentation, or maybe you have questions about, well, I'm really good at cloud, but I'm lacking skills here. Where do you think I should go to find more things, more interests that might provide more than just the spark, right? The spark is what you need, and then the capability to get driven towards a capability that you might be interesting of you. So about me, right? So I currently work at AWS. I work inside of ProServe, and so ProServe is the professional services arm of AWS. We essentially come in to align to the customer's need and work backwards from there to provide solutions, outcomes that meet the customer and exceed the customer's needs. But before joining AWS, I had the pleasure of working at such companies like UUNet, which some people might know, which was bought out by MCI WorldCom, and then after that, Verizon purchased MCI WorldCom. In there is AOL, which is really interesting because in Northern Virginia, those companies were basically a stone's throw from one another. So very fortunate to live in an area where we have these companies and their capabilities. I worked in the NOC at AOL, which was very interesting, as they were migrating from HPUX, HPUX machines to Red Hat, and so that brings back memories. I've also had the pleasure of working for some government focused companies, those being L3 Technologies, SAP, and Hewlett Packard. A lot of that was aligned to federal government, Fed Civ, GovCloud included. And then, I would be remiss to not call out my time at Hilton. Really loved working there, fantastic people. Very different industry, right? The hotel space, very in its own way challenging because you're having to bring technology into an industry where technology isn't like the birthright of that company, right? Hotel and resorting and beverage and food and service beverage, right, are the things that they're more in line to talk about ad nauseum, where technology can be a little bit more difficult, but very fun indeed. And then also some of the customers I had the pleasure of supporting in my time with some of these companies, the National Reconnaissance Office, which is again a stone's throw from some of these companies. I also did a stint at the CIA supporting them for their projects. So with that, let's go forward. Oh, I would be remiss also, Capital One, sorry, the click-throughs. So Capital One is who I worked for before joining AWS, where I met Ross. So with that, let's talk about some goals. You're going to gain a more intimate understanding of the unique IDs. Things that might speak to you where you will find these is CloudTrail when you're running a query against certain actions in the environment. Some of these unique identifiers will be there. And this talk is really meant to kind of provide you an analog on what these things mean and how you can leverage them for your own benefit. We're going to talk about some analogous technologies that mimic the underlying capabilities shown. That's just used as a parlance. Certain technologies, certain capabilities might be talked about to provide that kind of context of a given tool that helps you reverse something or get information about something. This will also provide you potential gateways to performing the same technique that we talk about in other services with AWS. I give a couple scenarios here. But this is really where I wanted to provide the baton to somebody else and say, oh, this is interesting. I wonder if XYZ service behaves the same way. And I really encourage folks to do this because at the end of the day, what we will talk about will not cost you anything. You can build some of these apparatus in the cloud and still be within a free tier environment. And then just provide the knowledge that even AWS doesn't explain in greater detail. And honestly, that's one of the biggest reasons why I joined AWS is to make it really clear that some of the documentation provided today should be enhanced and continually hydrated to talk about some of these challenges so that folks, including our customers and internal associates, can learn some of the ways to help troubleshoot in certain environments or work through certain incidents. And then outside of this, the goal is to get a better understanding about the relationship between these unique IDs and resource names. So some of the dependencies, in order to fully understand some of the topics that are being discussed here, that your organization or you should have the following dependencies. A free tier or personal account. This is something that, like I mentioned earlier, you could easily replicate in your own environment. And sorry for the dog in the background. Hopefully it doesn't come through in the mic. He's just saying how excited he is about cloud security. You can leverage AWS CLI. And then the scope and range for some folks is the understanding of the CLI. You don't have to be a ninja with the CLI to do and perform some of these capabilities. Even those beginners should be able to look through some of the slides that I will talk through to learn about some fundamental capabilities and then expand their knowledge upon that. Some core knowledge about IAM is required there to talk about roles, users, ARNs, things like that. That if you don't know what I'm talking about when I say an IAM user or role, you might not get the pitch here. Some core knowledge about S3 and bucket policies, that you're also comfortable with the AWS console. And I call that out as like muscle memory, being able to understand where you go to do these things to replicate what I'm doing here. And then a small call out to JQ, which will help you, as I say, chop up JSON to meet your benefit. I've had the question asked, why not use query or filters? That's fine. You can do the same thing. The outcome's the same. It's just the method that you use might be different. And so JQ can help you to slice up those JSON objects as you so choose. And so in here, just to call it out, is to provide you the knowledge about AWS Unique IDs that's not covered by AWS, providing you an edge in performing the current tasks. Incident handling, this can provide you investigation techniques, and then also an expansion of AWS tooling that can assist with tracking and tracing on who is able to access what in your environment. What we won't cover is some organizations, that's the service where you can provide service control policies, organizational structures for your accounts to flow into, where SCP policies flow down and are inherited to the accounts they're in. Automation, some of the capabilities here, if you're savvy with CloudFormation or any of the automation suite out there, your Terraforms, Ansible, Salt, Puppet, etc. Feel free to leverage that skill too, and you could replicate these environments that I'm going to talk about here very quickly and easily. IAM user role creation, we won't go over that. S3 bucket creation, the same thing is true there. JQ parsing, while the example here provides some of those newcomers to JQ, this might be a good way to get your feet wet on how you leverage JQ and the language and syntax to parse JSON. So some of the specifics that are assumed will not be covered, and these are the following topics, but don't let this halt you, right? If you're like, well, I don't know how to create an S3 bucket or what a bucket policy is. That's fine. Maybe go back and say, before really coming back to this conversation or talk or replicating some of these things I'm going to talk about, get comfortable with that for sure. AWS provides copious amounts of workshops, and in fact, something that my employer just provided is if you go to amazon.com/courses, you will see some free knowledge out there for folks that are eager to, get a little bit more familiarized with a given technology subset. It's free. So please go there, check it out. A lot of people may glaze over the announcement and not click on the link, but there's a lot of great information there on amazon.com/courses. So some other workshops here. There's a whole bastion of workshops. So if you're like, man, I've got automation on lock and I really want to learn about how to do XYZ, give that a look. And I guarantee you, if there's a certain technology capability there that you want to harness or come to understand, check that link out for sure. But on to the subject, right? So AWS Unique IDs. Okay, and so if you go out to AWS documentation and look for this, you will find the same table space that I bring up here. And so this Zelda, if you will, provides you the prefix of what the object actually is given the hash value prefix with the 4 letters. This is subject to change, and so for folks that might be watching this YouTube video or coming to see this slideware or something, just come back to the AWS documentation because there might be net new unique IDs added. I did check before giving the talk today, and this is the same state of play for today, end of 2021. So just calling that out. So we're going to focus on group, an IAM user, and roles specifically. While the other ones are important, those are the 3 that we will talk about in greater detail. And then, of course, the reference marker that I talk about here. So if folks want to grab a screenshot to maybe take that link, I can also copy this and put it into the chat afterwards if folks want it, which would probably be a lot more efficient than trying to type out that whole string. Okay, so example translations. This is where I talk about some of the parlance, right, for folks. So one thing I want to talk about whenever you're dealing with a really complex thing that you're kind of fearful about tackling, just think through this thing because this helps me understand where certain complex systems provide challenges. And so often complex systems require the need for other services, commands to deal with translations. These services or systems often are leveraged so that computers can do the thing that you want them to, right? But the human is like, I don't need to know all of that. I am just trying to do this thing. AWS requires the same translation service for certain things us mere humans can't comprehend or work through string characters and hash values like a computer can. AWS is very complex in that you have this very complex hypervisor, all of these objects and resource types. And so part of this conversation will touch on the translation that's used for AWS principal provisioning. IAM provisions resources. Those resources are part of the authentication pattern. And so here, just to talk through some parlance, right? We have human readable components in the column there. And then you have maybe some folks are like, I read that all day. I can read hex. I know what that color looks like, right? The same thing here is I bring in some of the unique identifiers, right? An AROA and an AIDA. Before long, it should become muscle memory to you when you see these exactly what they are, right? You have a role and you have a user. For me, I look at the R and the AR and go, yep, that's a role. A little way I cheat here is I think of AI, not like the artificial intelligence that we know, but I think of the individual here. It's a little bit of a cheat that I use in my brain to replace. So an IAM overview, you have the user guide here available to you for the structure of IAM. You have access provisioned, right? So the IAM user that you're provisioning, and then you have the access granted, right? We know that we want to provision principals in our environment. We want to provide them access. And so how do we do that, right? You have to generate IAM roles, users, and then IAM policies. An IAM role or user is effectively powerless until you attach an IAM policy to them, right? That's how you're providing power to that user to perform something. And so after doing that, you can provide a resource policy to allow in those IAM principals to access the resource. So the short and skinny is, an AWS principal is provisioned with rights. We talked about that a little bit. The policy is attached to the principal. The resource contains a policy that must allow for the AWS principal access to the resource. Without that in the resource-based policy, you're not going to be able to access that resource. And so fundamentally, you might hear things and other technologies about policy-based access control. This is effectively what we're talking about today. So what of it, right? Typically, resources come and go in a cloud environment. You have folks kicking off automation, cloud stacks, various forms of automation. But then, oftentimes the life cycle of a resource is overlooked. So, all this stuff happens, but then, where a resource is destroyed, the IAM principle continues to uphold its contents without change. Meaning, let's say this is an S3 bucket, I modify the bucket policy, the users that might have access fine-grained to that resource, the resource can disappear, and thus, the IAM principle has rights to something that effectively doesn't exist, right? Okay, so let's talk about a situation where the inverse happens, right? When an IAM principle is destroyed, how does that actually happen, right? Does the resource policy behave differently? We're going to talk about that, right? So I torch off an IAM user, let's say Bob from accounting got let go, or maybe a better story is that he moved on to greater pastures at company X, right? So they let's say he had a user that was provisioned, they removed it. So what happens to that? The other thing here, as you're thinking through resource-based policy, and then IAM users, and also Route 53 DNS entries that have not been cared for those folks that have ever had to manage AD or bind servers, right? This is the crux of what they do in operations every day, is making sure that proper hygiene is there. And really, the crux of the conversation there is how you take that same kind of challenge for Active Directory or bind server and apply it to AWS. Okay, so we craft a resource policy. This is an S3 bucket policy, and we're going to showcase an S3 bucket that contains some AWS principles that you have built that fundamentally have zero value for other resources in your environment, right? So we've got a user, role, we have another user, and then another role. It's really irrelevant, the powers they're in. But we're going to provide them access to all S3 actions and specifically a bucket, right? And so remember, IAM resources are not armed for work unless the policies are applied to them. That goes back to something that I call out when I'm mentoring really junior folks that are learning about cloud. Think of the role or the user, in this case, as like the hanger in your closet without clothes. The clothes are the policies, and you hang that on the principle to give it power, right? Your closet would be pretty barren without clothes within it. The same is true here. You could have a whole fleet of roles and users without policies, and they are effectively basically worthless. So we have some sample roles. Let's focus on the sans role right here, right? So the second line in the stanza. So what happens when we remove that role from the environment? We deleted that role, and you can see here that what happens is that translation happens. That AROA, if you remember AR role, right? It dissolves back to its prior raw state. And so what about that sans user? Let's go ahead and see what it looks like when we remove that principle from the environment on this bucket policy. Remember, we can see here that this role dissolves into this. And so there's the linkage in the tree that I brought in here for those folks that needed that refresher on what that looks like, right? So we see the mapping here. Okay, so we also removed the user here, and you can see it dissolved back to its raw state again, and as we shown in the prior slide. So we have a sans user has also been deleted, and the prior line that contained the AWS principle dissolves back to its prior state or raw state. These exist all too often in the cloud, where the provisioning of IAM users and roles, the lifecycle of those things have effect on your resource-based policies. And so it's important that as we go through this endeavor, you think through life cycle, right? The creation of something, the operational state of something, and then eventually, right, things need to get refreshed, or maybe there's a need to draw down or revitalize a new IAM architecture. This is things that happens to companies all the time, and they say, I don't know what to do with these. I don't know what these unique values are in my bucket policies. What do I do with these? So we're going to touch a little bit on that. And so I highlight here the AIDA that dissolved here, the user that you see here was the SANS user. Okay. Any questions before I move forward? Everybody tracking and tracing this? Look at the camera.
Makes sense to me.
Okay, good deal. So why should we care about these things? So what, right? We see some call it distillation of an ARN to a unique value. The unique ID knowledge and how it works will be extremely helpful to you. It will set you apart from some of your colleagues who might be looking at a Splunk query, could be a CloudTrail query, could be whatever, right? Sumo Logic query looking at CloudTrail logs. This will set you apart to understand that lattice and get you that extra edge on seeing things that other folks may not see with their eyes, right? And so the CLI output commonly returns some of these IDs and common queries that you run every day with the CLI, right? Where you're asking questions of the hyperplane, the hypervisor rather, and it's coming back with JSON objects that might have some of these hash values in them. Might is probably not the optimal word. You will see these. So an example, right? So if you go in with your CLI, and this is where that JQ component I talked about earlier, you see I use the raw flag here. Some people don't use that, that's fine. But then I parse out the user's object and look for username, user ID, and ARN. And so this is applicable because each bucket policy has unique IDs within it. But when you save the bucket policy, it reports an error. This happens a lot for DevOps folks that might be trying to update a specific policy, providing a user that does not exist. You will get some of these errors back. I've seen a while ago, a long time ago, I ran into a person who would build bucket policies using the unique IDs. And I thought to myself, like, why would you do that? They did not know that you could use and supplant the ARN instead of the hash value. And when I told them that, I mean, it was like news to them. I thought it was probably the most interesting conversation I've ever had, because I always thought it was commonly understood that you use ARNs, not the unique values. So the other thing of here is an actor could be leveraging these IDs as they know that there might be a segue where maybe it's during a pre-planning step where they scan the policy object, the resource-based policy object for certain account numbers, right? The ARN has the account number in it. You could look for specific things there. You could do some string, some regex looks to look for certain things. And so if an attacker were to slip in their AIDA, et cetera, right, with all the hash value, or the AROA and then the hash value, they could escape some of that line checking, let's call it that, where they could supplant themselves access to your bucket without you knowing it. So fortunately, AWS has a new capability that will assist you with this. And honestly, it's probably one of my favorite tools when speaking to customers about how they can continually monitor their environment for what folks can access in there. So just to call out, right, if you needed to play with JQ, I will tell you, learning JQ and how you chop up those JSON objects is extremely valuable, and something I've seen folks leverage in Python scripts, right? There's modules there to leverage JQ to do your bidding. So definitely feel like this is the Swiss Army knife and just one of the tools within it that you should look at becoming familiar with. Okay, so right out the gate, here's a cloud native security capability I wish I had. Oh man, I'm going to age myself. 7 or 8 years ago, when I first started working in the hotel industry. So Access Analyzer, not to be confused with Access Advisor, is a unique capability in that it leverages something called automated reasoning. There's no machine learning stuff here, folks. It is using very, very detailed math, semantic modulo theories, things that were born out of Microsoft's Z3 lab. And so with IAM Access Analyzer, you have to think of it, and this is where marketing, and I say this with my professional opinion, right? This is where I really wish they called it Resource Analyzer, right? Or something like that, because fundamentally, we all know and should know that it's incumbent on the resource-based policy where you allow principal access in, right? That's the important part to take away from here. And so when you look at IAM Access Analyzer, you can set this up in your personal account. You set up an analyzer for your account, and that account provides you a zone of trust. And you can see here, I blocked out all my account numbers and sensitive information there. But you can imagine, right, you would see your account number, your account ID, and all the external principals that have access to certain buckets. And so in the prior bucket policies, I fired up an access analyzer. I set up an analyzer on my account, and it starts to read in all the resource-based policies and doing analysis on the principles therein using something called, well, basically using automated reasoning. And so in here, you have the findings ID. You have basically a readout on the external principles. And then what I also like here is you might say, hey, this external role too, I know what that individual's up to. That's our partner. The really neat thing here that I like about Access Analyzer is maybe they just needed read and list rights, right? So this provides you a capability so that if that user was supplanted a specific level of rights, you can monitor this to say, well, wait a minute, external role two, that's a partner. They should be able to read data, but they shouldn't be able to make tags or write to the bucket. I need to go do something about that, right? So definitely try this out. It's free, so you can use this capability. Just make sure that you don't have it assess too many resources. I say it's free. I don't know if that's going to change in time. I know Access Analyzer is fairly new compared to all of the other services in AWS. So about this, right? We talk about the finding ID. We want to look at this external role, and it provides you that access level that you can actually tell Access Analyzer some of the things that you want to suppress. And so you have that at your capability, right? So you don't have to remember all these roles and things that you're like, that's a lot. I have a lot of roles in my environment, a lot of resources. You can actually work to build out capabilities where you can suppress some of these findings should you choose to. And so if we dig into the finding, right, it shows you the bucket policy, it shows you the external user, which is super helpful. It shows you the resource that it's showing that has access to, the assessment time. You can rescan this. And so that's something that I really, really like. So if you do find something that you need to triage, you can come back to this finding and rescan the object. But this brings you to the access where the resources irrelevant of the use of the ARN or the unique ID will be found. So this provides you some situational awareness. When will I most likely need to apply what I've learned today? As is the case with all cloud computing utilities, being well managed means that you should constantly be checking your resource policies for unique IDs or unknown principles. Access Analyzer is bespoke use is really for that cause. So why? I mean, why do I care? Those principles are destroyed. It shouldn't matter to me, right? I mean, they're gone. I just need to go through and just make sure that I do proper hygiene. Or maybe you just say, you know what, it's not really that big a deal. It's fine. While I say this openly, there's something called an encryption birthday attack where, as AWS states, right, they provision those resources that contain unique IDs. Those unique IDs are of a fixed length. And so if you know enough about encryption, when you have a fixed length hash value, you could run into a collision state. AWS has said that they build in protection to this, and I fully believe them, as trust is one of the number one things Amazon and AWS very much cares about with their customer base. But as any security person knows, that last line, right? We always want to trust the people that tell us things, but we also want to verify behind those things, right? So which situations have occurred where I started to see this? So performing investigations with incidents and general troubleshooting, I've experienced a lot of architects that, like I mentioned, they don't know what they're looking at. They're like, I just see these hash values. I think I got hacked. I mean, to that level of like tinfoil, oh my gosh, the sky is falling. It's like, no, it's okay. That was a role that the prior bucket policy and like your DevOps script, I can see the ARN you plumbed there. It doesn't exist anymore, right? And so getting that kind of understanding of this this reversal, right? When an IAM principle is removed from the environment, what happens is super beneficial. I mentioned the developer, right? Part of the story, he was plumbing S3 buckets with unique IDs. It ruined traceability. Nobody could read his DevOps code, and fundamentally just made it so much harder than it needed to be. So definitely be on the lookout for folks that are using that. So other examples, right? When you're operating at a large enterprise, the scale and the changes of IAM modifications can be so fast. And so it's important that if you know that that's true of the industry that you work in, that's okay. Changing IAM is going to be part of the process of iterating through your AWS journey. It's just going to happen, folks. But it's also important to make sure that you're vigilant and looking at your resource-based policies to care for those findings and scan them, right? Use of Access Analyzer, but then also looking for those unique hash values so that you can do proper hygiene in the case that you find that to be occurring in your environment. So a little bit of reflection time. What are the other patterns that you could replicate the same situation? Are there any takers on the panel here? And we have a smaller crew, which is totally fine with me. I think it's more intimate of a session where people can get to know one another and maybe ask a question. So with that, is there a potential area that you think this could also be applicable to? Anyone? Any guesses? Oh, a lot of people don't want to come off mute. So what other resources might be out there that could cause or have the same kind of situation befall them?
Well, I know you mentioned the one earlier with Route 53, where you can set up essentially a DNS entry. And then if you use a IP address that's elastic, you've tied it to a static IP. And then if you ever give that back to AWS, then whoever is the next customer who gets that same elastic IP can then impersonate with your domain name if you have a dangling DNS. I don't know what other ones that may also be like that.
So one, and that's a valid call out for sure. Taking care of your zones and the IPs that you put in there. That's a very, very good call out there, Ross. One thing that comes to mind to me is like Lambda, right? Where you might be provisioning a specific principal to invoke your Lambda. One opportunity there to test yourself is, what happens if you supplant that right within the Lambda, right? So that IAM principal has access to invoke it or do something with that Lambda function. What happens when you remove that IAM user? So the other thing here that I call out, while I love Access Analyzer, there are some services that it does not support. And so just be cognizant that while IAM Access Analyzer does provide a great wealth of capability, there are some lacking resource types there. And I know that AWS is very diligent on looking at an enhancement of this capability to cover other resource types in the future. So, Access Analyzer can't handle at this current time instance profiles, right?
Now,
We
Dan,
have,
can I ask
yeah,
one question on this here?
sure, yeah,
So a
absolutely.
key of these access keys, that's what you would see in the AWS PEM files that you get when you essentially need to log in and SSH into a server.
Yes.
If you delete that and then you see here's the IKEA in any of that source code, like in those policies that you mentioned, is there any way that IKEA would be still valid? Or because you've already deleted that key, there's no way it would still be valid?
So that's kind of going back to the birthday attack, right? Where, as AWS states, they have controls and capabilities in place to make sure that the reuse of some of these, not some, of these values is checked for reuse. In that case, right, the scrubbing, let's call it that, of that value, that process is so proprietary. I don't even know it. But that's what AWS states in its documentation, is that they understand the concern, but they have capabilities in place to make sure that the reuse of a hash value isn't valid. The other side of that is you have the AKIA, but you also have the encryption within the pen file, right? There's a value of the key in that space, and so the two must be there, right, for your access to be validated and allow you to auth into the box.
I just wonder if you're starting to see more attacks where, hey, somebody had deleted that access key, and so you just see in a key of value, but then maybe the attacker somehow has a way to just replace that a key of value with a key of value that he created on his AWS account that then would now have privs because it's inside the policies, right?
I haven't seen that. Where I have seen some shenanigans, for the lack of a better word, is use of user data, right? So that some folks understand the power that user data provides, and so you could say, well, we allow only folks to use this PEM key to log onto a box. Well, user data allows you to slipstream your own key material during the initiation and build time of the box. And so, be very careful about some of the folks that might say, oh, we handle our authn capabilities with a list of pen files. If you don't protect your user data field, you could find yourself in the situation where, you thought it was this, but then, user data was available to the attacker in this case, and they could supplant their own key material to access the resource.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. So it does not cover instance profiles, versions of managed policies, certificates. And so we touched a little bit on how dangling DNS entries or Lambda resource-based policies could be a potential area to see that float down to its raw encrypted, or not encrypted, sorry, hash value state. So try this on your own, right? Some folks say, yeah, I'll do this. They can work with groups, try other services, maybe see about what can be done with instance profile or managed policies here to see if you find another unique area to find the behavior of AWS out there. So one thing here is, what if I added a user from another account? And so this is where the aha moment comes in on where you could leverage this. So in this case, in the scenario that I'm putting forward, what if you added a user from a different account, right? So you have account A, let's say, and you provide access from another account using a unique ID, okay? So in this case, we're walking it backwards. It's kind of the reflection point. So we have a policy here, and we say, okay, well, I'm gonna go ahead and put in my hash value here. And so when we apply the unique ID into a bucket policy and then save it, right? What happens? Does anybody have a thought? So I'll tell you, when you go find, and in the prior slide, right, you could call out and get your role hash value or your user hash value from that JQ call. You're taking the hash value and putting it into this bucket policy. And so when you apply this and refresh it, you can actually see the change. Now go back, right? So it sticks. We have external role 2, we have sans role, and then sans user. But then we see we have this odd user that got translated, right? That wasn't there before. We saved the bucket policy. And so in this case, right, in a weird way, the bucket policy is actually translating the hash value that you provided into the ARN. Right? And so if you see sneaky things going on in your environment and you wanted to figure out where that account originated from, here's a great way to do it. Go build a bucket, go get a bucket policy, put that AROA or AIDA value into your bucket policy. Obviously, make sure your syntax is correct, hit save. And if that is a valid principle, it will uptick into its more human readable, although some people decry that ARNs aren't human readable, but you get the point. It's a lot easier than reading a hash value like you have here, right? And so you can see that this provides a capability where, how do you leverage this, right? So you, like I mentioned, you can use this capability like you would Nslookup for IP, right? To do the reversing of a DNS to an IP. You have other tools and capabilities to distill what that red value is in hex. The same is here true for distilling and reversing those AROAs into what that human readable resource, the IAM resource might be. It could be a service role that got changed by AWS, let's say. Maybe it's something that somebody's mimicking a service role to make it look like a system-defined role. Things like that do happen where I've seen attackers leverage some of the pre-built roles, service name roles, and maybe misspell something just so to somebody who's glancing through logs, they just skip over it, right? And so the same thing is here true, right? Where you can use Nslookup to distill what google.com currently reports out as IPv4 or 6. And so this can be leveraged so that you can actually translate unique IDs into their human legible counterparts. I remember showing this to some folks in an IR team, and they were blown away because this could have saved them copious amounts of time trying to figure out if it's a valid IAM principle in the environment or not, right? And so here's a quick and an easy way to supplant a bucket policy, putting that hash value in, saving the bucket policy, and you'll get the AIDA answer back, right? What it is, it's an odd user. So any questions about the talk that I gave? Anything at all? And that's the end of the presentation.
So what do you think are some of the most novel uses with doing this lookup back and forth? You mentioned maybe IR teams looking at it. Is there any other like SIM or other security uses that they're using to analyze data loss or anything else we should think about?
So I think one way the translation on validating, is that hash value an actual IAM principle, a valid IAM principle. That's the number one reason I wanted to put this talk together, because it's relatively easy to leverage the tool, right? It's not as simple as an Nslookup call, for crying out loud. But this provides the user the understanding of like, hey, I have this hash value. I don't know where it came from. Let me try this method to see if it actually is a valid ARN, a principal ARN. And then, by saving the bucket policy, if you get an error, you know that hash value is not valid and might give you an error. On the flip side of that, right, it could be a valid ARN that you'll get the full account number and name of the IAM principal. To your question, though, I've seen this leveraged more for hygiene, right? So that as a company is working through, maybe resurfacing an architecture of their IAM capabilities, removing some IAM principles, roles, users, etc. This is something that you'll find in your bucket policies. So in one way, it's important to look for this in your hygiene. I've seen folks look for this just to make sure that their bucket policies, are intact and actually human legible, where they scan their bucket policies looking for some of these things just to be hygienic. It's definitely something that people can automate with like a Lambda function, and even get into some auto remediation capabilities where they can do this on themselves to validate, hey, I found an AIDA and a bucket policy or a Lambda policy. We should probably scrub that and make sure that we understand, like, hey, something changed in the IAM environment. What did that go to? And that the challenge there is really how do you reverse back to a time? Maybe this is where DevOps really helps, because if you have that bucket policy template, let's say, you're going to have the actual ARN name, and that provides you an understanding of like, Oh yeah, that's that other system. Oh my gosh, Bob over there, that crazy guy Bob, deleted that role, and that is feeding this other system that it has to be online for this capability to work. Oh my gosh, we have a problem, right? And so, um, more so for hygiene, and then also uh, making sure that your applications, right, as those things distill, that you know when they do, so you can make sure you don't have like a sev1 or a sev2 wake up call and somebody saying, we got this thing, we don't know what happened, but there's this weird value in our bucket policy, right?
And with those values that you have, let's say the IKEA values or the AI values that you show, are they really hash numbers, or is it almost like a credit card number or a bank account number where the first half belongs to an organization and then the last half is truly unique? Is it like that, or is it just random numbers throughout?
From what I've ascertained, it is completely random. So like YubiKeys, right? Where I think it's like the first 12 or 13 characters, like the serial number of your YubiKey. To your question, I have not seen any kind of pattern matching where an org structure or an IAM principal in a given org has some like-minded values after the first four. Um, from my experience, I've only seen it be complete unique IDs.
Thank you.
All good. Any other questions, comments? Was this helpful?
Yes, it was helpful.
Good. Thank you, Linda. I was like, oh man, hopefully somebody thought this was helpful.
I just had to find my unmute button. Yeah.
It's okay. Appreciate that. How about this? From this talk, where would you like to go with this? If you had the choose your own adventure, right? What would be course A or course B, northwest, east, south, right? Where would you want to see this talk go?
I think that ability of looking at the external users is probably interesting, because is there a way to create an alert that says, hey, you got a brand new external user entering into your account?
Yep.
Is that okay with you? Or is that, hey, a malicious actor is now on your AWS infrastructure?
Yeah, I think to that end, let's say, and you'd be amazed how many customers, when I talk to them about Access Analyzer, they think, oh, we have that turned on. It's Access Advisor. I'm like, no, that's a different one. It's really one to detect the application of that unique ID, right? Some folks do a lot of checking on the application of a bucket policy, looking for specific account numbers. And so I kind of alluded to that as a way to escape maybe the application cycle of a bucket policy and supplanting your own, to see if you can dodge some of the radar sweeps of that scan. Um, Either way, right? When you save the bucket policy, it's going to resolve back to its true form, where that alarm could come through. But let's say maybe that's a condition where the check didn't go the extra mile, right? Oh well, we checked it upon implementation. We know it's totally good. You should always, always, always scan those resources continually, and not lean so much on your CI/CD pipelines to get it right for you. But yeah, Access Analyzer, check it out. Definitely learn how to use it. Zones of trust can be provided at the account level, right? So just to talk about that just for half a second, is that Analyzer can scan all the resources that it supports in your account. But you also have the capability to leverage something called delegated admin with Access Analyzer, where you provide a specific account the rights to be designated the owner of that service, and to orchestrate and administrate IAM Access Analyzer for you. what you get with that is the capability to provide an org analyzer, right? So think of that Star Warsy shield that I keep kind of imaginary with my hands here, imagining with my hands. But then at that delegated admin access analyzer, you have this org analyzer, which I find to be extremely powerful, because now you have this kind of capability to provide a radar sweep and scan for those resource objects in your environment and who has access to them outside of your organization. That right there, given the resource types it supports, is definitely hugely beneficial for me. And I know the customers that I talk about it, they're like, oh my gosh, like we have problems with that. We need to turn that on, right? Cool deal. Well, it was great seeing your faces, and Ross, always a pleasure to meet, to see yours and to talk tech and shop. And so folks, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to listen to me speak. But you know, definitely would like any other feeders. If you wanted me to give a talk about something else, feel free to let it rip. You know, if you wanted another talk and something I can dive deep into, let me know, because I really do believe in giving back to the community and sharing these techniques and capabilities. We all know the attackers are definitely sharing their knowledge amongst each other. It's important that we all share those things that we know that could help other people out.
Thanks, Dan. I think this was super helpful for each of us to come and learn from you and your expertise here, and look forward to seeing all the other cool things you're building and helping on the AWS front. You know, I think, as you mentioned, that Access Analyzer has a lot of cool capabilities. I thought I read some stuff of how you can use it to remove roles that hadn't exercised their permissions in like 90 days as a way to almost expire those invalid accounts. So I think that'll be a really cool thing to watch as that grows.
Absolutely. I think when you merge Access Advisor and Analyzer together, you have a lot of really powerful capabilities there to help you, you know, get further mileage down the journey of least privilege, right?
Awesome. Well, thanks again. We'll try to get a copy of your slides, and
Yeah.
we'll get the video and help make that available for anyone who misses the talk tonight.
Awesome. Great. Well, thanks for having me, folks. And this was fun, Ross. We'll have to do it again sometime.
Awesome. Have a great night.
All right. Take care, all. Be safe.